There are things that can keep teachers awake at night. Conflict between students, teachers or parents, wellbeing red flags and moments of crisis. In schools, educators must respond effectively to these challenges in an ever-shifting landscape. In this series, teachers, school leaders and wellbeing practitioners take on curveball scenarios from everyday school life, and in the process, highlight positive approaches to wellbeing. I'm your host Mick Walsh, and this is Trials for Teachers. Today I am joined by Dr. Stephanie Wescott, who is a lecturer in education at Monash University, also a research specialist in school-based misogyny and the manosphere, and how that impacts both students and staff. Welcome, Stephanie. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me. It's a wonderful conversation to be part of.
Fantastic. Are you ready?
I am.
Excellent.
I think.
Please note that the following scenario is fictional and any similarity to events in any real school context, past or present, is purely coincidental. At the end of recess, a teacher, Samantha, returns from yard duty to the staff room and she breaks down in front of a small group of colleagues. She discloses that in the Year 10 building, she had asked a group of boys to move outside as they were being too loud and physical in the space. Instead of following instructions, they surrounded her and laughed. Samantha dismisses offers of support from the staff present and says she will be fine going about her day. And so, Steph, as always, we'll go through an initial response, follow-up actions and ongoing support. But probably importantly, there's probably some established and emerging factors that have contributed to something like this taking place. And maybe it'd be really helpful to give our listeners a little bit of an understanding of maybe the manosphere and how it might impact on that scenario.
Yeah, so the first thing that I'm thinking when you're describing the scenario is that this is something that has come up in our research from lots of women, that, you know, there has always been an issue with women's authority in schools and their authority being respected and heard, and also their leadership being respected and their expertise and their intelligence. So, you know, this isn't, the manosphere has exacerbated existing conditions. It hasn't created anything new. So when women describe these things happening, they might say things like, well, I've experienced this before, but nothing like it is now. So this might have happened to them once, maybe in their career, or a few times, and now it seems to be daily or very frequent. So what the manosphere has sort of infused within the atmosphere of schools is that women are not to be taken seriously, or that it is entertaining to ignore them and embarrass them, or make them feel insignificant, and that is just a normal thing that, you know, men and boys can do to women. And so in this scenario, how it would relate to the manosphere is that, well, if boys have been consuming manosphere content, they will, or they might believe that woman is, that voice that's coming from a woman, that instruction is not really something that is worth their acknowledgement, because in the manosphere, men are superior. And so if they don't want to do something that a woman is asking them to do, they simply just don't have to do it. So I would acknowledge both of those things. It's probably going to be something that's familiar to women who are listening. It's probably something that's happened throughout their career, but it might be something that's being exacerbated recently.
Thank you. I think that gives us a really good insight into some of the factors that influence something like this occurring within the environment. Clearly in this scenario, this teacher's come back to a staff room, and there's within schools, there's perceptions of what might be safe places and what might not be, and has disclosed to a number of colleagues. It's quite possible that someone having that experience might have perceptions about how other people might think of them in terms of how they've handled an incident. Yeah. Maybe it's on them in terms of their behaviour management, but also that staff room might not be considered to that person a safe environment.
Yes. Yeah. It depends who's around. So in that scenario, when you described her dismissing offers for help, I mean, that it's so humiliating in that situation to be disrespected in front of young people or in front of your colleagues. And what can happen is that well-meaning colleagues who want to help can reinforce that the woman is not to be listened to, especially if there's a gender difference between the person who's stepping in. And what has also happened historically is that when these things happen to women in schools, they can internalize it, and they can also receive this message explicitly from their school that they just have to be tougher. It is because they are too kind, or they have, their relationships with students are not professional enough, or they don't have good enough boundaries, and it is therefore their fault that this thing has happened to them. And so when you're essentially performing your job in front of colleagues, you don't want to feel like you're not good at it. So you can just sort of try and remain in control, or seem like you're in control, that it's not bothering you, because you don't want to be seen as incompetent or not strong enough, or that you need help. Like it can be vulnerable to ask for help from colleagues. It can be a difficult thing to do. So that's something that can be avoided, or women can want to avoid that, because who doesn't want to be seen to be competent or good at their job, especially if you feel like you are, except for one scenario that keeps happening to you. So I think I can see myself in that scenario of wanting to just pretend that it's fine, but inside you feel devastated by it or angry, and you have to conceal those emotions, because it's also not often acceptable to be emotional and to cry in front of students. Certainly felt like, I've been in the classroom and I've cried as soon as I've left that room, or someone has just given me a smile or said, "How are you?" And that's enough to set me off.
Yeah, it's a sense that people need to hold it together in the environment to be seen as confident, and that showing of emotion can be perceived as a weakness.
Totally.
And how we support that person, even if it's something that they're dismissing in that moment, and they say that I'm happy to move on, that might not reflect the reality. It might be that the staff room's not a safe place. It might be that they don't have that person. So how can we best follow up to support that person in that moment and after something like this occurs?
Yeah. So my first instinct is that I would want to say to that teacher, that wasn't your fault, what just happened. And that might then allow them to express how they feel about it. If they don't have to sort of pretend that, that their skill wasn't the reason, or their competence wasn't the reason that happened. I think that can be really reassuring. And I think that is something that would have really meant a lot to me as a teacher if someone had have said that to me when I was a young, early career teacher. And it wasn't my skill that was letting me down. It was that those students will just do it to you because of who you are. So I think that sort of reassurance and recognition of the harm first is really important. And so I would say, what just happened to you? I'm really sorry. And that wasn't your fault. And you let me know how you'd like me to support you. Yeah. You don't have to say anything now, but maybe send me an email later or come and talk to me, because it can take people a while to process what has happened and to be, sometimes we decide later that we want action. We don't want it in the moment. We just want to forget about it, or we don't want to ask for anything of anyone. But then later we might go home and go, actually, no, that was wrong, what happened to me, and I want something to happen. And allowing women in that scenario to say, this is what I would like to happen, is a victim first or victim focused approach. And it's empowering for the person who has been affected by it. And it is an approach that's taken in cases of all kinds of gendered harm, but it gives that person agency to decide. And that's really important, because it can be infantilizing or patronizing sometimes when the person involved isn't part of the discussion about what it is, or if you sort of feel like someone's walked in and said, go and apologize to that teacher. And then you sort of get this student coming up to you and saying, sorry, miss. Yeah. And they've just been made to do it, and you feel further humiliated. So certainly say, let me know how you want me to follow up or how I can support you.
Yeah.
And then check in with them later. I will do that as well.
So proceeding with the blessing of that staff member and how they want that to be tackled, but also that idea that incidents need to be taken really seriously, and there's that a person who has been subjected to that sort of behaviour knows that it is going to be followed up thoroughly. There's going to be a process. There's a potentially restorative justice element as well. But that's sort of reflected in the Southern Poverty Law Centre research that forms a part of the Guide to the Manosphere, is that taking it seriously and for people to be seeing as victims that it is going to be followed up and it is of interest to the school to work through that is really important.
Yeah. I should clarify, in addition to saying, let me know how I can support you, there has to be a process that responds to that behaviour that is separate from how that teacher would like support. So there should be written in the policy, when students consistently fail to acknowledge the instructions of a teacher, there will be there's some accountability for that. And if it's a pattern that's occurring where it's happening to one teacher all the time or to a group of teachers who share whatever characteristics, that pattern has to be acknowledged and called out. It could be racial, it could be gendered, it could be homophobic, or it could be transphobic. And that's the real harm. So there's obviously the harm that occurs when you're not listened to and not heard, but when it's informed by bigotries that target who you are, that's when I think the real harm needs to be addressed for that person.
Aside from that initial support of the person, which is really critical because things can be really raw after something like that occurs, and someone might be questioning themselves really and whether they're going to be supported. And that's a reasonable expectation for a lot of women working in education, are concerned that their worries might not be actually taken seriously. So it's important that someone in this position would document and report what they can and be really clear about that. And so encouraging a colleague to work through that process and taking a statement might be a really critical step as well.
Yeah, I think so. And making sure it's a person that teacher feels safe with. It sometimes has to be, if there's a deputy or a wellbeing staff member who can step in then, I think that's really important, because we know that sometimes women don't report things that happen to them because they know it will go to someone in their school who won't really action it anyway or won't recognise the real harm. And so they just think, well, it's futile. There's no point because there's no outcome. There's no possible outcome that will come of this. Or, it might be in some cases that person it will get reported to is actually demonstrating some of these attitudes themselves, and that is known, and so they will avoid also reporting to that person.
As far as a person in this position documenting and reporting on the incident, the documentation of attempts to get support as well is probably important as well. Emails sent to leadership and how those concerns are being addressed. So that needs to be really clear. And in terms of the follow-up actions, so it's possible that someone within a pastoral care space or a year level coordinator or something is going to put in some actions in place to kind of mitigate this sort of situation with the boys gathering and those sorts of things. But we need to do that in a way that doesn't highlight that someone has failed in their job and now we're bringing the big boys in to kind of sort it out.
Absolutely. I think the way to approach that is to identify that it's a pattern of behaviour that is underpinned by one of those types of bigotry, that it's not we're stepping in because this teacher can't do it or they're inept and they need support because they're not strong enough or tough enough. We're doing it because we've recognised that there is an issue among some of the staff. So I think when you identify that this is caused by the sort of identity part of it, or the sort of the bigoted part of it, or that it's a pattern, you distance the problem from the person that it's happened to. You're still recognising that it's happened to them, but you're not interfering because you have to step in and save them, or step in because they're not competent enough to fix it, which I think is like useful because it doesn't humiliate them. I'm just speaking from personal experience. Like that's how I often felt, that like I felt humiliated and like I needed someone to help me. That's probably useful because you can do both things in recognise, you were targeted for this reason. It's a problem in the school. It's not in one individual teacher. And we're responding to it because we have a moral obligation to intervene, because we don't want young people to become adults who act in these ways, or who act on prejudice, or who don't learn that there is accountability or there is consequence when they behave in this way.
So there's probably some actions that people can take to mitigate some of that behaviour. And one question that people would often ask in schools is, why are these boys gathering in that space at that time? And why are they closed off from the rest of their community in that way? And so schools probably have a role in providing environments where diversity is the norm, where activities are taking place that are inclusive. So there's a little bit in that as well. And that doesn't work to sort of excuse any of the behaviour, because there's lots of factors that go into that as well. In terms of how we work with the boys is another element here. And look, speaking from sort of, from what I've heard from a number of educators as well, is that boys often will close ranks when something like this occurs.
Yes.
And when you're having those discussions individually, they'll shut down the conversations, they'll minimise what they did. It'll become things like banter, it'll become things like a joke. And so that can really provide a challenge to the work that we do.
Yes, absolutely. As you were talking about the congregating, I was thinking about how spaces in the school can be really hostile. And we've got some data that we're working on a paper on at the moment, which is about yard duty spaces, and how when women are placed on a yard duty that is a bit of a distance, like on the Oval, a bit of a distance from buildings, they are very vulnerable. And that's not an accident. Like, the boys aren't targeting them in that scenario with no knowledge of what they're doing. What we're sort of suggesting in this paper we're writing is that the woman becomes essentially just a woman in a public space when she's distanced from the school in that way. And so she becomes an easy target, but also the sort of distance from the sort of institutional buildings of the school allow the boys to behave in ways that they maybe wouldn't otherwise, when they know that the standards of engagement are different. So I think looking at how people move through spaces in the school and where spaces and areas might be allowing antisocial behaviour to occur, looking at the school like that, because schools often are old and haven't been designed with safety in mind necessarily always, or certain design principles that we might use now or might go into workplace design, like things like corridors and corners and concealed spaces, and just the vastness of them. And I know we've got out of bounds and areas like that for these exact reasons.
And that's where students tend to congregate. They find those places, right? The out-of-the-way places, the hidey holes.
They know where they can sort of escape scrutiny, visual scrutiny. So that might even be a preventative measure, instead of having to then respond to something that happens. If we can look at the school and think about, is this safe for everybody to move around here? Is there a space here that's going to allow or encourage or invite sort of antisocial behaviour? That can be a really good preventative measure. Students learn how to use power, and they learn how to create power or create atmospheres that are intimidating. I think we've all probably, most teachers, except some possibly, would feel intimidated in some spaces. Or would feel the way that students congregate with the intention to intimidate, or with the intention to be seen to be intimidating. I remember when I was teaching the boys, there was this sort of trend where the boys were doing this thing where they were doing this whistling noise that sort of sounded like a car with turbo, and they would walk around the school doing this noise. And I remember just observing it and thinking, what is this about? And I know that they do things because they become contagious, but I was like, you're announcing yourself in the space as owning it by making that noise. You want us all to see you. You want us all to observe that you have the sort of authority to make an unsuspecting noise that we all have to sort of hear. So I think that they know exactly what they're doing. Teenagers know that when they gather, they can intimidate people, and they do it not just in schools. I remember a few years ago, I was in my local sort of shopping centre, and there was a space right near the lift where everybody had to go down to the car park. It's a very small, like, suburban shopping centre, and teenagers will always gather around those doors, the lift, and so everyone has to sort of walk through them to get to the lift. And it was very much about intimidation and ownership of the space and just being menacing because they could. And one day, I mean, when you've been a teacher, you learn how to use your body language to convey things. And I remember I was with my son, so I probably looked quite unsuspecting because he was a baby at the time. And I just stood there and I just looked at them all and waited for them to move so I could get through. And I think that they sort of felt that coming from me as well, that I knew that I could be an authority because it was probably teacher energy that I'm picking up
teacher energy. You've got to use that as much as you can. I love it.
Yeah, but it happens in schools. So I think that it's not an accident.
Yeah, and it is gatekeeping that those spaces as, like, you have to kind of,
move through me.
Move through me, exactly. When we work with those students, I think that getting the, one way that some schools might approach this is to get the boys together to have the conversation. And probably, my perspective would be that it's better to have those conversations separately because, in a way, regardless, you move away from the pack mentality, but you also give individuals within that space a chance to be vulnerable about their ownership of it.
Yes.
And probably what you find is that there might be some within a group who might be more comfortable with what they did than others who might have been on the periphery. And that sort of can paint a bit of a picture. So working with those individually, what are your thoughts on with the support or with the blessing of the person who's been affected? What are your thoughts on that restorative component?
Yeah. I think it has to be done properly for it to be meaningful. In our studies, women often raise restorative justice approaches as an issue for them because they're sort of made to feel like they've done something wrong because the way that it's been set up for them, they feel like they are also admitting culpability, or they're being required to admit culpability and say, well, maybe I shouldn't have spoken like that. So it has been an issue for some of the women we've spoken to. They feel that they're putting them equally with a person who has hurt them, or the power is off because the boy can sometimes just say whatever they like and they can't because the woman is there as a professional and as a teacher, and she's got to maintain that dignity, and so she's not quite able to speak freely. And I think for some women they're sort of like, okay, restorative justice, what are we restoring? Because if the relationship wasn't respectful initially, maybe it wasn't, maybe it's been an ongoing issue. For them there's actually nothing to restore because it was never a respectful relationship.
Yeah, there was no sense of equality from the start.
Absolutely. So I think the principles of restorative justice would never, in its proper and truest sense, would never enable a dynamic like that to occur. And yet, because we're moving away from more punitive approaches, which we want to, it's absolutely right that schools do that. We, I think, sometimes lose the balance that we need between accountability and compassion or understanding or empathy. So I think in some situations it's probably okay. In some it's probably not okay. The woman might not want to sit there and have a student explain how she made them feel that then was a catalyst for the behaviour. It's sometimes, I think, feels to them like, but there's no excuse for this. There can't possibly be. I think the person who facilitates it has to be very well trained and very careful of those dynamics. So I think a balance is probably good between allowing accountability for the young person to know this is just flatly unacceptable, and also, seeking some insight from whether the teacher would be comfortable in that, and that might not necessarily be the first choice for them.
And there might be an instance where, and completely understandably, that person doesn't want to be involved in that process, because it could be, if not handled well, it could be humiliating. It could sort of double down on those feelings. It could re-engage trauma from the incident.
Yes.
But somebody needs to work with these boys, and it needs to be, whether the boys understand what they did was wrong or not, there needs to be some really thorough education about the impact.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that is really important. But if someone does need to educate them, they do need to learn that what they say and do affects others. And then even as I say that, I'm thinking, how could they not know that? We, from early childhood, teach children that, we don't harm other people, that what we say has an effect, that how we treat people matters. So I think sometimes claiming ignorance to those things can be a way to get out of a consequence. I think we have to give them more credit than we sometimes do when they sort of claim that they didn't know, or I didn't know. Sometimes they say, I didn't know what I was saying. I've just heard people say it and I didn't know. And I sometimes think, well, then why did you choose that particular person to say it to and not your principal or not your male teacher? If you can pick your target or your victim, you probably know what harm it is that you're exacting. So, yeah, I think that, teachers are intuitive, they're wise, they're experts. And I was actually going to say before, when you were talking about grouping boys together for the hard talking to, what is unfair about that too is that there are boys who shouldn't be in there listening to that because they would never do it. So assuming that all boys can be grouped in together and told you're all being this and you're all being that, that could just be so alienating and accusatory and unfair for boys in there who are sort of thinking, I would never say that to a woman. I would never treat a woman like that. I respect my teachers. And often it's actually boys who report things that are being said about women in their school because they're so horrified by it. They'll come up to their teacher and say, Miss, I need to show you this, or I need to tell you this, because they're mortified. So, we always want to say not all boys. And then we have to believe that when we decide how we're going to deal with the problem. So I totally agree that saying, well, all boys are boys, so they therefore must be behaving this way, that's really unfair.
In terms of when we get to the point of how we can sort of monitor this situation going forward and the ongoing support that we can provide, you highlighted that there's some sort of interventions or prevention processes within school, which could be described as upstream, where you're trying to put the things in place. And so there's policies, there's school policies, there's providing anonymous reporting channels for people or ways that they can express the experiences that they've had. Is that something that is common? Have we as a school system evolved enough to provide that policy context in which to support incidents like this?
I think it's pretty exceptional still. I think we're not really focused on prevention. We have policies for response and behaviour responses, but something I've learned a lot from that I didn't know anything about when I was a teacher, I've just learned it since working with my colleagues who are in violence prevention. I've learned about the whole, significant historical, the field of violence prevention. And it didn't occur to me as a teacher that you could prevent. Maybe I did know that probably through relational pedagogy. I knew that if I was relational, I could actually prevent a lot of bad behaviour. And that was the one thing I had, I could be kind and that would lead to respect. So that, in a way, I guess I did know about prevention, but I certainly didn't know that, gender-based violence prevention was work that schools can do, and that actually there are policies from the Australian government that name schools explicitly as places where this work can be done. And we have evidence from numerous studies now on respect for relationships implementation that demonstrate that when respect for relationships is delivered well and properly throughout the school, that behaviour improves and that school climates improve. And that's prevention. That's using curriculum and teaching and learning to improve the conditions in the school. So I think that we could learn a lot from violence prevention. We could learn a lot from just thinking differently about, rather than just responding, how do we make the school safer in the first place? And I think it would be unfair to say we don't do that, I guess, because we talk about values and we will have, codes of conduct. But I think aligning it more strongly with violence prevention from the sector of violence prevention, I think could be really, really powerful work for schools to do.
Yeah. And I guess as you've sort of suggested there, Steph, the work that you do before can create an environment where we don't see examples of that behaviour, but we also have the supports in place to support someone who's on the receiving end. So it's really clear that if something does occur, where they can go to get support, and they know that they're going to receive that support, which is our starting point. To highlight some of the takeaways, Steph, we talked about how we've got to really support that person in the moment and some of the steps that you might take, and that any steps need to be taken with their blessing, and they need to know that they're going to be heard. We talked about the idea of making sure that we document and encourage that, so that we've got a really strong record of what has occurred, so that the work that we do in terms of reporting that to leadership or any action that a staff member might take outside of that environment as well. We talked about mitigating the behaviour and some, the reasons for people congregating. I was really interested to hear about your work in that space as well. I find that really interesting, particularly for yard duty teachers. And that when we're working with these young men, we need to be really careful that we don't lean into that group mentality that we've just been trying to dismantle. We work with them individually, and that schools developing really stringent policies and upstream approaches can be a really great way to mitigate some of these issues that might occur. Thank you so much, Steph, for your conversation today.
No problem.
I'd like to finish with a wellbeing wind down. So I ask each of my guests something that they do to look after themselves, or something that brings them positivity in a day-to-day basis.
I think that throughout my working life, I have not been good at this at all. So I'm really honest when I get asked this question, because I often will let it get to the point of burnout or where I'm just really struggling before I recognize that I'm a human being who needs to live a human life. And that means sleeping properly and exercising and eating proper food and not just having coffees all the time. So it's in my nature to neglect myself quite badly, and pragmatically, or just like, I'm pretty honest about this, and I'm not afraid to say that looking after my mental health means not just sort of the self-care as we usually talk about it, but also working with a doctor and using medication to manage. And I'm a neurodivergent person, and so that means that things can just be harder for me, and I need a little bit more of whatever it is to recover often from difficult things. And sometimes I think we talk about these things as great strengths, and they are, but they also mean that the world can be more taxing than it is for others. So I think that the work that I do is made for me in so many ways, in sort of being rooted in justice and fairness and pursuing better outcomes for all people, but it does come at a cost, and I have to take that really seriously, because if I'm not well, then I can't be a good human being, parent, friend, partner. So remembering, I think it's the basics for me of being a human being and what that means. I have to remind myself of that, and I'm really bad, but I'm trying to be better.
Okay, I think there's a great message in that for everyone. I often think about, the things that you do during the day and the steps that you take, and generally they're all positive steps as a person. You try to do things that you're good for your well-being. And I'm going to let you, just a bit of vulnerability here, Steph, I'm going to let you know one thing that I do, and particularly around Easter time, Christmas time, whenever there's chocolates available, is at the end of the day, our kids, they don't need that much chocolate, do they? Kids don't need a lot of chocolate.
None.
Surely not, right? But they end up getting it. They end up accruing a lot of it. So inevitably that little bag goes in the cupboard, and I'm the person who hits that up. Just one a day, right? After all the big things you do all the day, all the things the heavy weights that you carry as a parent, as an educator, that little chocolate. Why not?
Why not? I think you deserve it. We all deserve it.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for joining us. Contact us through our socials to have your say. And to all the people who hold the line in our schools, while you're all busy taking care of others, make sure to spare some time for yourself. And until next time, this has been Trials for Teachers.